Hello from Hamburg. I'm now in Hamburg. I was in somewhere else. I'm getting very confused. This is the first travel, like proper travel I've done, and so I'm finding it extremely befuddling. But due to the fact that I'm at a conference here, it means that I'm going to have to finish at 1:30. So today's session will be half an hour shorter. But what I'll try and do is finish up the bits where I'm talking in about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. Then we'll have a short break, and then you'll can ask me questions. So. I presume a few other people will start coming in as we go. In fact, I can see lots of people showing up. So I'm just going to kind of go. So this is the second of sort of the two sessions that are sort of supposed to be a sort of rollicking intro to the sorts of things that people have been thinking about in the philosophy of historical sciences generally understood. Last week we had a reading of mine, which was really me trying to make it more or less impossible for people to think about underdetermination anymore by just making it so complicated and annoying. And so I thought that was a useful paper for thinking about the way that people have been approaching these questions. And the second paper, which is much more speculative and in a lot of ways much more in territory that I'm scared to tread because archaeological theory is scary and archaeologists are clever and they make me afraid. I thought this was a useful one for sort of thinking about the sort of new various ways that people have started to think about the philosophy of historical science. So I'll just sort of share my screen in a completely smooth way and start this going. Boom. Okay, so I take it you all can see just a black screen now? Yep. Okay, cool. Let's start off. So I thought what might be useful would be to start by kind of doing a vague connection to the previous week. So one thing that you may have found interesting about today's reading is that it's quite different. It's really on what seems to be a very different set of topics than what we were thinking about last week. But I think they might be more connected than we anticipate. So the way I framed a lot of last week was really in terms of kind of this debate that Carol Cleland sort of started up. And you may recall that Cleland had this particular view about what you're doing when you're doing historical science. What you're doing is you're first noticing these correlations between traces. You go out into the field, you find objects, and you go, why are these objects correlating in these ways? What you then do is generate a bunch of hypotheses. You generate a bunch of hypotheses in the past, and you sort of say, well, if this happened in the past, that would explain these currently observed correlations. And then I go hunting for smoking guns. I say, well, what further traces could I have that would distinguish between those various past events? And last week we thought about sort of various worries you might have about this kind of view. And there was one sort of worry that I thought would be worth emphasizing. And this is one which was really, I think, really nailed by Ben Jaffers. So Ben has a paper where he really emphasizes the way in which historical science doesn't simply rely upon, having a trace in that testing hypothesis. It also relies upon understanding the processes by which those traces are formed. So because he says, because the historical scientists utilize regularities, even when they're interested in one-off events, they gain access to the confirmatory apparatus of experimental sciences. So what he means by these regularities is really things that connect current observations, traces to the past. And in this, Jaffers is heavily influenced by what are often called kind of processual archaeologists. So these are archaeologists in the sort of 60s to sort of 70s to early 80s who have a particular agenda about how archaeology should be done. So here's an example. So Lewis Binford, so he says this: the archaeologist investigates phenomena that he has reason to believe remain from the past. So you're looking at current phenomena, traces, and they are remnants of the past. These investigations are all conducted in the present, and that results in sort of the observational statements, if you want, the things that archaeologists say are contemporary facts. I found this object, if you want. So the question then for someone like Binford is, how does an archaeologist convert these contemporary observations or facts into meaningful statements about the past? So you notice that Cleland, to some extent, seems to take it as written that you have these traces and they test between different possible past events. But for someone like Binford and someone like Jaffers who picks this up, actually the bit where you connect the trades to the past really takes an awful lot of work. One way of putting this is when we were discussing Cleland's view, of course, we were thinking about the ways in which this possible impact event 66 million years ago may have led to shocked quartz, to a layer of iridium, and a mass extinction event. What someone like Jaffers would point out is that this is crucially missing what justifies, as it were, those lines, right? We don't just need to know about the traces. I don't just need to know what shocked quartz is. I also need to have an idea of a set of regularities about how those traces form. Picking up again on this processualist tradition, they have this term middle range theory. And Jaffer says, middle range theory, this is research which tries to find regularities in how those sites came about, right? To find regularities between the observable remains and the behaviors of those past people. Let's admit whoever's coming in. And here's a way of sort of getting it. Here's the kind of example that Jaffers uses. So here is some really interesting marks on a piece of bone. What makes these marks interesting is that they look kind of pretty damn purposeful. They look like the kind of mark you would make perhaps if you were butchering whatever animal had this bone. And in fact, when they were first published, it was suggested that this is the remains of a butchering tool, but a very old one from over 3 million years ago. To test this, what do? Well, we have replicas of these butchering tools, and we might test it against the sort of effects you get from animals feeding on carcasses. And the exact study that was done was, let's see what happens if I chip away at these things using, replicas of the sorts of tools that were used at the time, and see what happens if I get, say, a crocodile or an alligator to chew on it. And lo and behold, it looks as if these marks could have been plausibly made by an alligator, not by a human chipping away at it. And so this is a way of testing a hypothesis, notice, where what you're not doing is going and looking for more traces. What you're rather doing is you're running an experiment that itself tests whether your interpretation of that trace is right, whether you've understood the kinds of processes that could lead to that trace. And so the sort of point that you get from Jaffers's critique of Cleland is that she's kind of focused on one relationship between now and the past, which is the relationship between the traces and these past hypothesized events, but that's not the whole story. There are also the relationship between our capacity to experimentally confirm regularities of how these things form. And it's those things coming together which tell us about the past. And so the idea here is that if we're going to make inferences from various traces to things in the past, you need what you might call middle-range theories or mid-range theories. Now, I'm not as happy about calling them middle-range theories or mid-range theories as I used to be, in part because I can't be bothered arguing with people about processualism versus post-processualism, but just regularities, theories about regularities which explain how traces form. And sometimes, at least, these can be experimentally confirmed. And so the question you might ask is, well, how much trouble does this cause for Cleland? Doesn't this show that, in fact, experimental methods are available to historical science? And Cleland, of course, is well aware of this, and she has a kind of answer. And this is a sort of very typical answer of her sort of approach. You may recall that on Cleland's view, these are prototypical or paradigmatic kinds of reasoning. What the historical scientist is doing, what the experimental scientists are doing, are kind of paradigms. They're idealizations in a certain way. And so we should expect there to be a lot of mess. We should expect individual researchers to do different things. So Cleland responds to complaints like Jaffers by saying, look, those generalizations like the one that is connecting the bone to the fossil to the past, if you want, like from taphonomy, these play a secondary role. They're not the targets of historical research, but useful tools borrowed from other disciplines for special purposes. One way that I think about Cleland's strategy here is that she has this kind of account of historical research, and every time you try and say, but it is different in all these other ways, she's able to sort of collapse it into a particular box by saying, but the primary purpose of that research is searching for smoking guns. So you say, but we need to do experiments in order to establish these regularities. And she puts it back in the box by saying, no, this is because you do those experiments to establish those regularities in order to support smoking gun reasoning. And so Cleland has this kind of a very difficult view, in a sense, to argue against. But what I want to do today, and what I sort of do in this paper, is really focus on a kind of set of practices within archaeology, which is experimental archaeology. And I need to make a bunch of caveats. First off, experimental archaeology is diverse, it's rich, it's a thriving practice where a whole range of different people, some of them, professional, institutionalized archaeologists, but also people in museums, also hobbyists and other people, more or less are attempting to construct simulacra of past artifacts using something like the same processes. There's a huge sort of variety of these. And what I'm interested in doing today is thinking about what we can say about this practice. And it may be that we want to reflect upon the sorts of things I have to say in terms of this earlier debate with Cleland. So what I've just done is emphasized a particular way of thinking about things like experimental archaeology. You might say experimental archaeology is a set of strategies for establishing regularities, for establishing middle range theory. And that, is the way that Bench Affairs uses it. But actually, when you look at the people who talk about experimental archaeology, they do say things like that, but they also say other things as well. So this is Francois Baud, who is in the sort of, 60s and 70s, was a extremely accomplished flint napper. And he spoke about this in a very different way. He said, no publication, no conference, no movie will ever replace the actual production of the tools you're studying. So when Baud is at conferences and he's talking to skilled nappers, people who do flint napping, and archaeologists who'd never done it, he found that it was really difficult to sort of communicate with those who hadn't really done it. He said, we compare these archaeologists who haven't done it, to skilled nappers. It was much more difficult to pass on information to those who had never taken a hammerstone or an antler in their hands. And as he says, I feel them more than I see them. And I suspect that flint napping will have to become a necessary part of the training of any archaeologist interested in prehistory. So here we're not really talking about testing regularities, experimenting upon middle range theories. We're rather thinking about this embodied knowledge, the things you gain, the maker's knowledge you gain from, in fact, building one of these things. Given the topic, I think it's probably worth taking a few minutes to look at someone doing this. So this is just a 3-minute video of someone making a prehistoric flint axe. And I think it's really interesting to pay attention to it, attending to just the kind of level of skill that's involved in doing this. So hopefully the sound is coming through.
Hi, I'm James. I'm here at the Neolithic houses at Stonehenge and I'm about to attempt to make a Neolithic axe head. I've got this large piece of flint here. So the first point I'm going to strike is here. The flint that I'm using is around about 80 to 90 million years old. You get flint from the whole area around here under Stonehenge. You get it across from North Norfolk in a band all the way through to Dorset. Now it looks very different. It's much lighter. There's a lot less of that waste material in the skin of the flint. It's starting to take on a bit of a lens profile to it with this consistent cut-in margin all the way around. And these are those edges that I'm going to use to start to take even more flakes off and help me refine this preformed blank into a longer, thinner axe head. I'm just working on refining the butt or back of the axe, and this is where it'll go into the wooden handle. So I need to make it quite even so it has a good fit into the wooden haft. In some cases, I can predict the rough shape and size of the flake before I strike it. So as you'll see, I'm working on one side and the flake's coming off the bottom, so you're almost working blind. You have to go with that confidence that the material will stick to its mechanical principles and will flake off in a certain way. The flint is made up of silica that would have been secreted by tiny organisms that would have knocked along the sea floor, and that would have been compressed into this rock that we have today. So I think this is about there now. This is ready to be ground and finished into that really nice polished surface that you often see on Neolithic axes in museums. And this is an example of a finished, polished flint axe head. This will have taken about 60 hours worth of work to get it to this kind of stage. It really is a beautiful piece of work, as well as being a really good functional tool for cutting down trees and woodworking. It would fit into a handle or haft, a bit like this, and there it is, a Neolithic axe.
So one of the things I find really interesting about watching people do that is both the sort of level of sort of skill that's required and really sort of embodied skill. Like, these people have messed up hands. It is not easy to do, physically speaking, let alone in terms of the sort of skill, but also how aesthetic, the way that they talk about the kind of products that they're doing. And this sort of leads me to really think really hard about what sort of the epistemic properties that these things have. So we can think about experimental archaeology in terms of a kind of embodied know-how, but we can also think about it, as I was earlier, in terms of testing archaeological hypotheses. And really what I'm interested in doing in this paper is talking about both those aspects and how they kind of feed into each other. One way of thinking about it is, what are the epistemic goods? What do you get out of experimental archaeology? One thing you do is you get to test archaeological hypotheses. That's what Benji Fairs was saying, and that's what Carol Cleland was responding to. But I want to say there's a lot more to it than that. I want to argue that it generates a kind of a form of maker's knowledge. And that maker's knowledge plays a really critical role in a bunch of archaeological practices. It allows them to understand and critique archaeological work, and it well positions them, I think, to generate certain forms of integrated explanations. It also sort of something which is very close to my heart, is it gives us a way of thinking about speculation, which I think is really different to how people usually think of it. So really quickly, this is the sort of structure that I'm going to sort of bounce through in the next half an hour. I'm going to very quickly sort of go through this notion of trace-based reasoning, which to an extent I've already talked about. So that's going to be very quick. I'm then going to introduce two problems. This is this notion of integration, this problem of integration, the problem of Xeroxing. I'm then going to really quickly sketch this notion of maker's knowledge and the ways in which we might learn about, think about the sort of embodied nature of this work, of this skill in terms of maker's knowledge. I'm then going to sketch this case study, this Deborah Oleson's work on these Danish daggers, and then I'm going to sketch the work on speculation. So from here on in, to some extent, it's going to be a quick fire shoot through of the paper. So, there may be things in the paper I don't touch upon. Feel free to bring them up when we sort of start asking questions. Quick caveats again, experimental archaeology is super diverse in terms of practice, in terms of function. I'm focusing on flint napping with a little bit of a few other things. There's a lot more going on. And also I am really skating over a bunch of really rich areas of archaeological theory, which I'm doing partly because of space and time, and partly because my brain is not very good at thinking in the way that archaeological theorists think. And so it's very useful for me to have them yell back at me if possible. So one way of thinking about experimental archaeology is to think about it as an important part of what Anton Killen and I have called trace-based reasoning, which just works as follows. This is very sort of Clelandy. You have some past event, and it has some causal dependency with a trace. You have a fossil, and you have some living animal dying, or something like that. And what you're doing is you're inferring from that trace to the past event. In this context, you have two separate types of hypotheses. You have the type of hypothesis that Carol Cleland emphasizes, the idea that some particular past event occurred. And you have another hypothesis, which is one about the causal dependencies. These are the regularities that Benji Fairs is emphasizing. Some events of that type leave traces with those types of features. And so you need to have both of those in order to make these kinds of inferences. And so in the case you did before, we might have a hypothesis that something was caused by butchering in the past, and then we might have the trace being the sort of signs of that butchery. And so the view here then is that experimental archaeology is testing hypotheses about what traces those events would leave, and this is crucial for trace-based reasoning because it provides those regularities. So far, so good. I don't really have anything interesting, I think, or new to say about that. But here are two kind of worries we might have about archaeological reasoning generally that I think experimental archaeology may be able to help us with. So first, a really interesting complaint you might make about experimental archaeology is that like all experimental traditions, they form traditions, they form lineages of practice. And because archaeology, as it were, is supposed to be about these particular sites, it's supposed to be what's happening here, if experimental archaeology is decoupled from that site, that can have various problems. Another issue, which is not directly about experimental archaeology, is this interesting tension where archaeological interpretation is holistic. For good reasons, if you're an archaeologist, you want to understand the sites of interest in a way that's integrated, in a way that's like a living system in the past, right? But analysis, when you're digging something out of the ground, when you're cleaning it up, when you're running it through various experimental procedures, that isolates those features. And so there's a kind of interesting tension between being able to isolate various features of a site, but then also being able to provide a holistic interpretation. So just to sort of focus a little bit on Xeroxing, so you might think that we've got, imagine we've got sort of two sites, and we have a reconstruction of a particular process that was done from one site. The worry with Xeroxing is that what I'm doing is instead of looking at what is done in a particular site, I am instead just building something the way that someone else did it. And so it's kind of floating free in a certain way from the site, or worse, you're projecting the way things were done at a previous site to the way things were done at your site. That's the kind of worry about Xeroxing. And Martin Bell, I think, sort of captures this idea. I owe the term Xeroxing to him. He describes it as, in terms of roundhouses, which is a sort of practice in the United Kingdom. He says, Reynolds' roundhouse constructs have been highly influential, in a way probably too much, because many of these examples are Xeroxing. Basically, one experiment reproduces rather than tests the results of another. So in Britain, 61 experimental roundhouses have been constructed on 32 different sites, but the vast majority have been based on Reynolds' principles. So you just have someone doing the same experiment, as it were. It's a case of replication, whereas what you want to be doing, at least according to Bell, is you want to be testing those sorts of hypotheses, particularly in light of differences between different things. And I think there are two kinds of worries we might be able to bring out, two ways that we might capture this worry with Xeroxing. One is to do with the relationship between those two types of hypotheses we spoke about earlier. There's the hypothesis about the event occurring in the past, and then there's the mid-range theory, the hypothesis that events of that type leave traces with those theories. Now, when I'm doing this kind of inference, it had better not be the case that the mid-range theory is the thing which determines on its own the result of the hypothesis, and vice versa. We kind of want a sort of independence between those two hypotheses. This is what Alison Wiley has called vertical independence. So you've got the hypothesis you are testing, say that a particular building site was used on a particular building technique was used on a site. Then you've got the various hypotheses, the mid-range theories, which facilitate those tests. The building techniques leaves traces with those properties. And here what I mean by independence is to do with the evidence we have for those regularities, right? Clearly, the facilitating ones, the middle range theory, count as evidence for the hypothesis you're testing. But it better not be the case that the hypothesis you're testing then counts as evidence for your middle range theory, because that creates a kind of dangerous circularity. So what we mean here by failures of vertical independence is you're using the thing that you are using to confirm your hypothesis to then be confirmed by that hypothesis. So there's a sort of dangerous circularity. The second worry that I kind of implied earlier is archaeologists are very interested in the peculiarity and the differences, the heterogeneity of the different sites that they're interested in. If Xeroxing sort of involves sort of taking a particular technique and just projecting it, there's at least a chance that Xeroxing will obscure those differences. Now, neither of these are completely inherent to the practices of experimental archaeology. I don't think they, in principle, as it were, are problems. But the point is they often practically are. Integration I can talk about sort of much more quickly. So we have, how do you do archaeology? Well, you find things at a site, you extract them from the context in which they were found, you store them often for very long periods of time. Sometimes you prepare them. Sometimes you send them through various types of experimental procedures, carbon dating, so on and so forth. So you end up with a bunch of very, very isolated bits of data. What you want to do with that data is you want to create a sort of integrated picture. So in a sense, you move from a sort of integrated, real, in situ situation to a much more sort of abstract, disunified situation. And there's this question, how do you move back into being integrated? So this is what Jones calls fragmentation. So you might say, like any production of data, in fact, archaeological work involves decontextualizing. You take your material remains out of their deposition. All of these processes, like extraction, cataloging, and analysis, involve a bunch of loss of information and a bunch of isolating your item from the other things. But archaeological interpretation is holistic. And so what tools do archaeologists have to answer that question? And so I'm going to argue that once we understand the sort of role of maker's knowledge in experimental archaeology, that lets us say something nicer, as it were. It gives us a sunnier conception of this Xeroxing problem. And it also suggests at least part of the answer as to how it is you can do these integrated interpretations. So to get there, of course, I have to talk about maker's knowledge. Now, maker's knowledge is a notion with a very, very long history. It's very important in from medieval through to early modern Western thought. And a lot of this is to do with God having made the earth, and therefore God having some kind of special knowledge that we can't have. I'm going to sort of scuttle over almost all of that. They're happy to talk about it later if you'd like. Here's one thing I might ask about maker's knowledge. And to be clear, by maker's knowledge, I mean the knowledge you have as of an object or of a situation if you have made that object or brought about that situation. One thing you might say is that maker's knowledge involves a special kind of content. You might say that there are things that only the maker can know. What you might say instead is that maker's knowledge gives you a special or a better access to content, or it might be that you have a particular justification of the content that you have. Now, I happen to think that thinking about maker's knowledge involving sort of special content is a fight I don't want to have. And understood very sort of casually, I think it's a sort of, it's a very interesting, as it were, philosophical question with a capital P, but I'm not a very deep philosopher, and I don't find it a very useful way of thinking. Neither does Maureen O'Malley. She has a lovely paper about maker's knowledge in the context of a bunch of other things, in the context of some other types of biology. And she points out that, look, people have lots of knowledge of things they can't build. Astrophysicists know a lot of faraway galaxies, even though they can't build them. Biologists understand a lot about biological systems, even when they only observe and experiment them. They're not necessarily constructing them. This is in a paper about synthetic biology. And so it's coming from, the idea that the stuff that you cannot know unless you build the thing or unless you bring the thing about is a kind of very open and very difficult question. I think we can make a lot more progress by asking about the second point. Is there a special justification or easier access to knowledge if you built something? And we find this account in Floridi's 2018 paper. This is a very, very capital E epistemology paper. But Floridi gives an account of maker's knowledge where he crucially talks about maker's knowledge as knowledge of a system from within, not from without. So the idea is you compare the account, as he puts it, the justification that someone has of their knowledge when they have brought the thing about versus if they have seen it or if they have heard about it. And Floridi wants to say that if you've brought the thing about, you have a different type of account. Your account is, I did it. I was part of the system that brought this thing about. Whereas if you've heard of it or if you've watched it, then the things you will appeal to in justifying your knowledge are different, right? As opposed to, I successfully did this, it's, oh, I trust this person and they told me, or it's, I have reason to trust my observational capacities in these contexts. And so the idea is you have a different epistemic basis or a different account for that knowledge. I take this idea and I develop what I call sort of a notion of positioning. So I want to say that some epistemological process, and a process might be making, it might be observing, it might be hearing about, it might be testimonial. Those processes, well, position some agent towards some knowledge, just in case engaging in that process makes it more likely that they will learn that knowledge compared to some relative alternatives, right? So the question we ask is, what does making a stone tool, doing flint napping, well position me to learn better than watching a video or having someone describe flint napping, So what does it well position me for? And so I want to argue that experimental archaeology, at least of the flint napping type, well positions us for a type of embodied skilled knowledge. And there's a huge, ridiculous discussion to have about the nature of embodied skilled skills in this paper. And now I'm going to be, in some sense kind of cheap and draw on John O'Sutton's work. Not that John O'Sutton's work is deep, it's very rich, but it's shallow in my case in that I'm not going to delve too deep into this stuff. So John O starts with this distinction, very classic distinction of psychology between episodic and procedural memory. Effectively, episodic memory is my memory of particular events. I remember presenting this paper and stumbling over my words, whereas procedural memory is memory of certain skills and procedures. There are various ways in which I present talks that are kind of more or less skills that I just embody and do. Jono, I imagine cricket is not really something that this audience has encountered very often or knows very much about, but my hope is you can just replace cricket for any old have ball hit with weapon hit with wooden thing game. And I think most people have hit ball with wooden thing games. So hopefully our relative knowledge of cricket isn't going to matter. But the idea is there is the cricket player, the bats person, and the ball is coming, and they have their episodic memory. They remember, people throwing balls at them in the past and them hitting them well or hitting them badly. But they also have procedural memory that's more automated. It's how to stand, how to move. And Sutton is arguing against this idea that in expert skill performance, these things are pulled apart, right? So the usual sort of line on this, or the received wisdom on this, is that skilled performance involves cutting off procedural and episodic memory. Because after all, I cannot keep track of everything. I cannot remember all of the particular events. I need to just automatically let my skill perform. And he thinks that's a big mistake. So what Sutton wants to say is actually skilled performance involves a lot of episodic memory. It involves a lot of executive control. It's just that executive control is working in a slightly different way. So as he says, experts, so expert batsmen in this case, require their embodied routines to be continually responsive to varying conditions, and thus have learned to influence themselves, right? So the intelligence of the skill behavior has to be flexible. And we can see this, I think, if you recall the video of the flint napping, right? He's having to really, really change how he's doing those hits in terms of the effects they're having on that rock. This is not a kind of automated skill performance. Rather, it's one which is deeply intelligent and deeply flexible. And so there's actually a rich interaction between the episodic and the processual parts of that memory, right? And so I think it's reasonable to say that flint knapping is a complex dynamic skill which involves integrating both the habitus, both this bodily learned procedural memory and this probing awareness, this episodic memory of how the task is unfolding. So to sort of steal Sutton's words, we can think of flint knapping as a form of regulated improvisation and a dynamic interceptive action, which is very fancy words, but hopefully you sort of get the idea. So I want to say that what we gain, in addition to testing hypotheses, in addition to establishing middle range theory, when we do experimental archaeology, we also gain this kind of maker's knowledge. And I think that this maker's knowledge can help us with Xeroxing and integration. So remember, I gave us two worries. One worry was, hey, experimental archaeology, like all experimental experiments, forms a tradition. People learn how to build a flint knap, not by looking at a particular site, but by going and hanging out with a flint knapper and learning how they do it. And as such, all they're doing is reproducing previous experiments. They're not testing hypotheses about sites. And Bell thinks that's a worry. The other worry was integration. According to this worry, hey, if you're going to be an archaeologist, you have to extract, isolate, and experiment upon the various bits and pieces in archaeological assemblages, but then you have to find a way of integrating these together again. The account of maker's knowledge just says, hey, what experimental archaeology well places us to do is to have knowledge of the skilled embodied procedures. What I want to do now is quickly go over this really lovely case study on Danish Daggers, and from there I'll be able to come back around to notions of Xeroxing and integration. So here is some of these sort of beautiful daggers that are made sort of all over the place. For some reason, they tend to be associated with the Danes, so good on them for that. As with any sort of common thing in the archaeological record, there's a very big discussion about how these daggers function. Are they ritualistic? Are they used as symbols of authority? So on and so forth. And there are also questions, of course, about their actual production. Was everyone making these daggers? Were they produced by skilled artisans? Were these professionals? Were they guilds? So on and so forth. Now, the debate that Olesen and some other people as well are intervening on here is one that has very much been driven by this practice in Scandinavia and other places of people having a really apprenticeship-like structure where you have particular people who are very, very, very skilled at making these, and they have people who sort of apprentice to them in order to learn it. And there's been a tendency to project that social structure, that sort of apprenticeship learning model, onto the past. And Olesen is one of a group of people who's saying, actually, like, that's a bit quick. There are lots of different ways that these sorts of daggers could be found in these past systems. And one of the things that I really like about Olesen's work is the way in which he uses both the sort of skilled embodied knowledge and aesthetic judgments of flint knappers, of modern flint knappers, to then generate various types of really clever quantitative measures. And those quantitative measures, she's then able to sort of produce this sort of really integrative and I think really interesting picture of the way in which these daggers play into the kind of lives that were lived in the past. So here's Olesen talking about contemporary knappers. So these are if you want, the experimental archaeologists. So they measure their skills against those of the prehistoric makers of flint daggers. So if you've made a good dagger, what makes it good is how it relates to daggers from the past. Many of these daggers, these old daggers, have high aesthetic qualities, but she points out there are also large numbers of mediocre or ugly ones lining museum shelves. Right? So some of these daggers are very, very fancy, but a lot of them are actually not. And this is kind of crucial. So here is sort of this picture from Olesen's paper. On the left, you'll see the sort of finest dagger, and on the right, you'll see the crappiest dagger. There are daggers of different types, but it turns out that these, different types of daggers, there are many, many varieties within them. There are great ones and bad ones. And notice as well that contemporary knappers more or less agree on which of these are the most beautiful, which are the most impressive, and so on and so forth. Okay. So what Olesen does is she quantifies the judgments of difficulty and aesthetic achievement that these knappers have. So this lets her build various measures of dagger quality. One of the things she finds is that within dagger types, there's a huge amount of quality variation, but not across daggers. What she also does is examine contemporary napper practice, and this generates estimates of how much time will be required to construct all those daggers, right? So she's using the contemporary nappers, the experimental archaeology first, to give a sense of dagger quality, so she can do quantitative comparisons across a whole bunch of different daggers. And she's also getting estimates of the time required to build these things. And she comes up with, she manages to get rid of a bunch of hypotheses, right? So she says production volumes don't speak of mass production or dagger factories. There are a lot of daggers, but there aren't that many. We also don't see any evidence for dagger workshops in the archaeological record. So she thinks there's no demand in an economic sense for large numbers of skillfully made daggers. So she thinks that the number of skilled daggers you have and the fact that the highly skilled ones aren't functionally any better, and the fact that there is no evidence of people trying to mass produce the good daggers suggests that actually thinking that these are objects that are being produced for their aesthetic properties in an economic context is kind of the wrong sort of move. What she wants to say instead is the skilled daggers are better thought of as produced by these the very skilled hobbyists. Perhaps one way to think about it is for those who have seen Parks and Recreation, kind of the Ron Swansons, people who are producing these things as just ways of showing their own skill. So she has she has the analogy of someone like Mark. She says, Mark, who is a cabinet builder, he's not doing it for money or anything. He just wants to build beautiful cabinets, right? Striving for artistic excellence and driven by a personal sense of satisfaction, but crucially not making a living, is a better model for the makers of the finest late Neolithic daggers. So these are people who share a lithic habitus, which is to say, she thinks everyone is building daggers. All members of Neolithic society were able to knap flint at some level of skill. Kind of like how everyone is going to be playing probably not cricket, but some game where you're hitting a thing with a ball, right? The poor and mediocre daggers suggest that large number of individuals are making them with varying degrees of success. There are a few individuals who are particularly talented and interested, and when they had time on their hands, they experimented with flint. They saw how beautiful, how much they could perfect their techniques, and this was just for the joy of perfecting their techniques, or maybe showing off to their other, expert friends, as opposed to this being a sort of crucial part of the economic activity. Now, we may agree, we may disagree with Oleson's analysis, but I think what's really interesting to me is the way in which he's able to develop this highly integrated picture based on such limited information. And so very quickly notice that this is a very different way of thinking about what you do with maker's knowledge than testing hypotheses. What Oleson does is she takes a community of practice that's been built upon all this embodied expert skill, and from that develops a bunch of quantified measures, and those measures are then put to the material record. If we're thinking about Xeroxing in terms of hypothesis testing, we start worrying about independence, and we start worrying about heterogeneity. But once we realize it's maker's knowledge, we realize actually we have this rich community of practice, and we can use the judgments, the knowledge that that community of practice has in order to build various quantified measures. And notice that I think that one thing that's interesting is that Oleson is not herself drawing on this kind of embodied knowledge. So far as I'm aware, she's drawing on the flint knappers' embodied knowledge. But nonetheless, because the flint knappers themselves are relating to one another in various kinds of ways, she's in a good position to integrate that into this kind of rich interpretation, shifting from a bunch of quantified measures related to the material record into this picture of how these things lived with those past societies. And so I think that understanding experimental archaeology in terms of maker's knowledge really helps us get to grips with these further epistemic benefits that you might get. Right. So in addition to just testing hypotheses, to establishing mid-range theory, experimental archaeology forms these communities. We can understand Xeroxing in terms of expertise that's being transmitted within those communities. And that can be critical both for developing measurable applications to the record, but also well places archaeologists to integrate these sort of isolated bits of information. So that's the main thing I want to say. But I want to finish by just sketching, it's developed more carefully in the paper, of course, but this idea of experimental archaeology being a really interesting form of speculation. So when people talk about speculation, when philosophers do at least, and they don't do it as much as they ought to, there are often two things that are emphasized. First is speculation is thought of as a hypothesis. A speculation outruns evidence and is justified pragmatically. It's justified sort of via pursuit, if you want. And second, there's this idea that speculation is kind of theoretical. When someone's speculating, what you're doing is you're generating hypotheses by kind of sitting back in your chair and going, maybe this, or perhaps you're doing it on a blackboard or a whiteboard or something like that. And so speculations are hypotheses. They're justified via pursuit. It's a typical claim. Another one is thinking about speculation as a theoretical or imaginative activity. I think we can think about experimental archaeology as a speculation made material. And I mean material in two senses. The first, which I can expand upon, sort of follows John Norton's view on induction. So Norton says something like, what makes an induction a good one or not is not determined by how it fits into some kind of argument schema. Rather, it turns on sort of a whole bunch of rich local facts of the matter. I want to say similarly about justification. The justification of a speculation is not to do with its syntactic features, it's not to do with its boldness, as Popper might say. Rather, it can only be understood in terms of the sort of local facts and context of that study. But also, I think more interestingly, perhaps, it's material in the sense that the kind of search space that speculation is in is constructed and delineated by a physical system as opposed to by a problem space or an imagined space or a theoretical space. So to articulate that second point, when people think about speculation, they often think about this in terms of a problem space. You can imagine this, here I've got a sort of circle, a sort of two-dimensional space, and various points in that circle are going to be possible solutions to your problem. And you might add a third dimension, and the height on that third dimension is going to say whether they're good or bad solutions to that problem. And people often think about speculation in science as scientists moving around these kind of problem spaces and trying to creatively find solutions. When we're thinking about experimental archaeology, we're thinking about flint knapping, what delineates that problem space? Well, it's the person and it's the piece of material that they're working with, and maybe comparisons between that material and other pieces of material, which strikes me as a sort of fundamentally different way that a search space might be constrained. And so it's a very different kind of speculation. And I want to say that it's the way that the material conditions of experimental archaeology give archaeologists this capacity to explore not just any old search space, but really interesting search spaces that explains how productive this experimentation is. That's why it's a good practice. And we think about speculation here in a very embodied way. It's not imaginative nor abstract, at least it's not purely imaginative nor abstract. And here, the justification of speculation is material, so on the basis of some logic of discovery or heuristic. And so, what are the epistemic goods then of experimental archaeology? Most philosophers have said, well, something like testing archaeological hypotheses. That's what links us up with the discussion between Cleland and Jeffers. But that's only the very, very beginning, right? It also, I think, generates maker's knowledge. It gives us this embodied, skilled knowledge. That's crucial because it allows archaeologists to, in a sense, sort of speak the same language. It allows them to understand and also critique various parts of archaeological work. It also allows them to generate these kind of integrated explanations. And finally, we should also think about experimental archaeology as a kind of material speculation. It's something which allows archaeologists to explore the capacities and the possibilities of what humans can do with various kinds of materials. And that point, I think, is really important because it allows us to see, in a sense, that archaeology and I think other historical sciences are not necessarily only or even fundamentally, you might think, about the past. They're also about possibility. They're also about the capacities of various agents, various processes in order to generate various things. But why don't we start with Alexander?
As I mentioned the previous week about this archaeological experiment as an epistemological tool and tool of archaeological knowledge. One thing we should bear in mind, and that is that experiment can show us how traces or features in the archaeological record could have been made, and especially how not. And that is why very important, because if we make this mistake of following just logical procedures, we can make a big mistake. For example, seemingly successful hypothesis of test hypothesis or testing a hypothesis can be totally wrong in archaeological interpretation. I can give you very known examples. For example, Thor Heyerdahl's very famous experiments, Contiki, for example, or later Ra, where he, coming across Atlantic in a papyrus boat, where especially Contiki was, as an experiment, very successful. He did prove that you can make balsa raft and go from South America to Polynesia. What he tried to prove, his hypothesis was totally wrong, that Polynesia was settled from South America, and we now know from various archaeological traits like Lapit pottery, genetic sources, etc., 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 that it was the other way around, that people were settling Polynesia and Pacific Ocean from southwestern Asia. His later hypothesis with Ra was even worse. He did prove in 2 attempts and with the help of National Geographic motorboats and helicopters that you can make a papyrus boat and move from Egypt to America. But certainly his idea was totally out of date, 19th century extreme diffusionism. So one has to be very careful in epistemological terms, just not to correlate successful test of archaeological experiment and archaeological interpretation. What is important about experiment is that it can show us how traits could have been made and very probably have been made with microtraceological, for example, traits. Of course, in Silex tools or something like that, this type of traces can only be made if you cut grass with a stone tool or something like that. But we must bear in mind this always have this sort of epistemological awareness in that respect. That's just my...
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with that sort of point. So I threw in the chat there, actually, I've got me and some other co-authors have a paper where we talk about this notion of a Contiki experiment, where precisely the point is, what you're not doing really is directly testing whether or not migration was across the Pacific was eastward or westward. You're rather testing whether something of this type has the capacity to do something like this.
Exactly.
And there's a second step, right, which is, well, could they? And yeah, the thing that's there, like I love the Contiki case because it's so interesting because, of course, the way that people responded was by doing much richer Contiki tests, right? So the response was, well, what happens if we actually build sort of things based on Polynesian designs and also start using various navigation techniques that they're using. So through the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, you get this sort of another experimental tradition, which is pushing back against the Contiki experimental tradition, which is, I think, really fascinating. But yeah, the basic point so I'm kind of tempted at this point to say, and this is kind of interesting in terms of the way it fits into the philosophical debate that I sketched last week. So last week, someone like Derek Turner says, hey, look, hypotheses in historical science are always underdetermined, right? They're always blah, blah, blah. But actually, if you think of historical science is about establishing the capacities, if historical science is primarily about discovering capacities and then making inferences based on those, that actually a lot of the evidence is not underdetermined. It's not underdetermined whether it is possible to, navigate across the Pacific. Now, it might be underdetermined, and whether in fact it happened. Whether now that's a different question. But I think that really getting that difference, as you put it there, I think is really important for understanding the epistemic structure. So it was a very long-winded way of me saying I'm very much in agreement with you there. Thank you. Let's I think someone in the big room.
Yes, Sasha Babish from the big room. I was wondering, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for introducing archaeological issues into the field of philosophy of science. It is very important for us archaeologists. And I also would like to thank again to Slobodan for the same thing and for coaching me through some philosophical stuff on my tedious journey through that. And I only have, in fact, one teasing question. I don't know whether it would be relevant for you. Whether you think that the maker's knowledge, which I take to be the crucial part of your argument today, whether you take it to be the same of the experimenting archaeologist, that his maker's or her maker's knowledge today would be the same or different than the one the person in the past was having, and if that is at all relevant for your argument, whether this question is at all relevant for your argument.
No, that's an incredibly important question, and it plays into the stuff in really fun and interesting ways. So I mentioned that one of the mistakes, at least in Oleson's view, that earlier interpretations had was they had projected the kind of hierarchical learning structure of contemporary flint knappers into the past. And that's kind of an example of ways in which you might be making a mistake in thinking that there are sort of similarities. You might overthink there are similarities. Now, you're asking this in terms of maker's knowledge. I suspect that the maker's knowledge of someone who's learning to flint knap now is in many ways going to be extremely different from the maker's knowledge of people in the past. And the big difference is we don't live in a society where people flint knap all the time, right? The difference between me having this very individual particular thing that I've learned because I'm a weirdo and I want to learn how to make flints is very different from the knowledge that, say, lots of my friends who live in countries where football is played, they just kind of have this like weird innate football capacity. Even if they haven't played it very well, they'll say I'm not very good at football. They will destroy me because I don't live in a country where people are just kicking balls around all the time. It's not part of your sort of social habitus. It's maybe one way of putting it. And so I think so and this matters because, for instance, one of the things that Oleson does and one of the things that some people in Australia have done is try and work out the time required to learn, for instance, to flint knap. And the way that you do this is you grab a bunch of undergraduates and you teach them to flint knap and you measure how long it takes them. And one of the, that's interesting and important, but it's massively limited because they didn't grow up in flint knapping societies. So that's one way in which the maker's knowledge is going to be different, right? The way in which you're going to, you're not part of a flint knapping culture. And so that's going to make a difference. But other aspects of the knowledge might be crucially similar, right? And this is the thing that I think is really interesting about your question, is it makes us realize that we can't just think about the content of the knowledge as one thing. The content of the knowledge is going to be a wide variety of different aspects. So I might be tempted to say something like, maybe one way of putting it is the sort of technical part of the habitus, how to hit it and where to hit it and that sort of stuff. That might be very, very, very similar. And it might be very, very similar because there's, so far as I understand it, there aren't too many ways to successfully build a sort of, to flint knap, right? To actually get a good, sharp edge on that thing, it's actually pretty tricky to do. It's really constrained by the materials, which again is pretty lucky. And so in those sorts of cases, it might be that some aspects of the knowledge is highly stable. That's the kind of thing that we might be able to project. But other bits of the knowledge you might not be able to. Like, for instance, just because the only way to get someone nowadays to learn to flint knap is to, sit them down, have this very hierarchical structure, where they effectively have to apprentice in it, right? That's very different to living in a society where everyone flintnaps. Then people are going to, as it were, more intuitively or tacitly kind of know how flintnapping goes because like mum and dad were doing it around the fire, when, etc. And so the ways in which it's taught might be really different. But it could be that certain aspects of, say, the phenomenology, certain aspects of the sort of embodied skill might be really similar. And so I think one of the things that's really tantalizing about thinking about this sort of maker's knowledge is precisely that it makes me start thinking, well, which aspect of this lived experience is something which I can reasonably think is similar and which aspects are not? And notice that as soon as you start doing that, you then start asking these other questions about, well, what's different about their society? What's different about the sort of material conditions that they're living under? And how might that influence the differences in their sort of embodied skill? I don't know to what extent that was speaking exactly to what you were after, but hopefully that was what it led me to say anyway. But I do think, yeah, you can't just say the knowledge, right? There's a huge variety of knowledge.
Well, yes, that's more or less what I wanted to talk to you about. Because what you are in fact doing in a way right now, for us who've been drunk on Binford ages ago, is in fact you're giving us an insight into the question that was being asked of him: how the hell do you get to the hypothesis? Because that is taken to be the weakest point of the whole story about mid-range theory. How the hell did he want us to get to the hypothesis to be tested? So what you are suggesting right now may be one of the answers to it. But nevertheless, if I may add, I wouldn't really put aside all those debates that people are having between processual and post-processual archaeology. I think that might come in handy for your argument that you are now trying to elaborate right now. Thank you very much, nevertheless.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I think you're right. Like I will get to in a second, Borislav. I'll just respond to that quickly. Yeah, something which I hope it's obvious that I'm like quite ignorant about is various aspects, particularly of the sort of post-processualist tradition. And I think part of this is to do with my let's call it my philosophical heritage, right? So one way of putting it is that I'm a philosopher of science that's sort of raised in a kind of analytic tradition. And so I find sort of things that are what's sometimes called continental philosophy difficult to understand. And often post-processualism is sort of aligned in various ways with sort of continental philosophy. I don't like talking in these ways, but it's a way of explaining why I'm often very bad at getting at what they're talking about. I often find it extremely obscure. But at the same time, so yeah, let's put it this way. Sometimes I'm in a very critical mood, and I think something like the following. There are all of these fancy theoretical debates that archaeologists have about, oh, is the object living? Is it not? Was it, how do we think about culture? Are we really anthropology or are we not? These sorts of debates, which I often think, you know what? You're all digging stuff out of the ground and then trying to work out who made it and how. And I'm often left kind of, this is me when I'm being very critical. So I don't really believe this per se, but it's a mood I get into sometimes. You're all doing the same thing ultimately. I'm not sure what difference these theoretical debates really make. Of course, they sometimes do. But that's something I'm sort of, when I'm feeling particularly uncharitable. But I do think that they're really, but when I'm feeling more charitable, I do think there are really interesting and critical debates going on in theoretical archaeology. And as you say, between processualists and post-processualists, precisely about how we should approach interpretation, and more importantly for me, what the function of archaeology is. What is archaeology about? Is archaeology about, how people lived in the past in some sort of straightforward, I made an inference kind of way, or as someone like, say, Barrett might say, is archaeology about uncovering the many ways in which humans might live? Is it more aligned with certain types of anthropological projects? I do think that's really interesting. I suspect that my problem with this is that I'm bad at thinking in the right way to be able to grip with them properly. And so downstream, one of my goals is to be able to understand that stuff. And I've hung out with some folks who are pretty good at it, and I haven't made much progress, but maybe one day I'll be ready for it. But we should move to Borislav. He's been very, very patient. Oh, you're muted.
First of all, I would like to say that experimental archaeology is a very important thing, and I think that in your article and in your lecture you prove that. But I would like to ask you two questions about. First one is about Xeroxing, because at the beginning we saw that it is a kind of copying some solutions. For example, if you have some kind of buildings or kind of any other things that somebody built based on his or her knowledge about past, some other people just copying that. So so we have Xeroxing. And you said in your article and in your lecture that it is not so bad. And I have to say that I haven't find much of your thinking about that, but why it is not so, why it is so important, and why it is important to have a Xeroxing in a procedure, in archaeological procedure. That is one thing. And the other thing is integration. We have that example of Olafsson and Danish Daggers, and that was a good example, I have to say. But that was only one example, and I have to say that I don't in that kind of explanation you have only one good example. So I would like to ask you two things about Xeroxing and about that experimental archaeology and integration. Something more about that, about significance of experimental archaeology in integration.
Great. Yeah, no, those are two really good questions. So let's start with the first one. So what's going on? Why do I think that the notion of sort of copying is something that we should sort of take seriously? So part of what's going on here in the background is a story that about sort of what makes a scientist and what makes a scientist think like a scientist of a certain stripe, right? And I'm just going to include some people might not like me including archaeology in terms of science, but I include so many people in the category of science, so don't worry about it. Part of what I think makes someone take on, if you want the sort of paradigm, to use the Kuhn language, is people going through a certain type of learning process, people learning to solve certain types of problems in certain types of ways. There's a reason why the way that you're trained to be a scientist is, hey, do this experiment, learn to do this type of analysis, learn to do this type of analysis. There's a reason why, as a philosopher, my training was, here's an argument, here's another argument, here's another argument. This is a good argument, this is a bad argument. What I'm doing is I'm picking up that habitus. It's not just that I'm learning some propositional content, I'm also learning various kind of tacit ways of doing business. And I think that processes of these experimental traditions, learning how it is that the archaeologists who you are reading went about building these things and doing things, strikes me as sort of really important part of kind of becoming an archaeologist. Now, of a certain type. Of course, archaeologists usually would talk about this much more about field work, right? Archaeologists will often say, hey, it's critically important that you do field work. Even if you're going to spend your entire life in a lab, you've got to do the field work because that teaches you about archaeology in some fundamental way. That's a very common way that they speak. And I suspect that something somewhat similar is going on with experimental archaeology. Now, I just spoke of that in terms of pedagogy, in a sense. I spoke of that as if this is a thing, like the boards who I quote was like, everyone should do this when you're learning to be an archaeologist. But I think that we should take that much, much further than that. I think that, people often, philosophers in particular, will often talk about the stuff as mere pedagogy. It's just what you learn on the way. But I think that actually most scientific work is significantly more shaped and influenced by those sorts of material practices than we tend to recognize. And so the reason that I want to say that, of course, naturally, I think that when we are thinking about it in terms of hypothesis testing, those worries about independence and those worries about not being properly attuned to the peculiarities of your site are absolutely on board. I don't disagree with Bell in any strong sense on those features. The point is more, hey, actually, you shouldn't think that Xeroxing is always bad, because Xeroxing is kind of required for you to gain the kind of tacit knowledge, or it seems to be required for you to gain the tacit knowledge that lets you then kind of see that these things work differently. So the way I talk about it in the paper very briefly is, I've got that talking about the people who think that the way that you should categorize and understand flint tools is in terms of just how reduced they are versus what their function is. And I think that, having spoken to some of the people in that debate, it really seems like a lot of that is turning on their experience and what they learned from building these things, even though they were building them in the same way as the other people. So again, it's an extremely partial, weak defense. Second point, this is a great sort of objection to throw at a philosopher like me. But the second point was, okay, you give me one good example, so what? Aren't you cherry picking? What are you doing here? A philosopher like me, by that I mean someone who tends to work with case studies. I tend to give arguments by going, here's a case, here's some cool stuff about it. And you might think, if that's supposed to be a data point, if that's supposed to be evidence in like in a numerative induction, then that just seems like a crap argument, because I've only given one example. So how is that supposed to be a justification? To that, I say a few things, and they're complicated things. One is, I'm not using it as a data point in that sense, right? What I'm not doing is saying, here is a data point that you should use to make an inference. What I'm doing is I'm saying, well, I'm doing a bunch of things, and I think it's actually okay, maybe, that I'm a bit ambiguous as to which of these things I'm doing. One of the things I'm doing is I'm using it as something to think with. I'm using it as, in the same way that an archaeologist, not the same way, similarly to how an archaeologist might use a material object to constrain the ways in which they theorize, I'm using a piece of archaeological practice or a bit of theorizing to constrain what I'm doing as a philosopher. So it's giving me a sort of point of resistance to my presupposed ideas about what good reasoning is, right? And so I'm not using it as evidence in that data sense. I'm rather using it as something to think with. Whether or not you should believe the claims I'm making, whether or not we think these are representative, well, that turns on your going and looking, right? Like, one thing I might say is, you'll notice these annoying bits in this paper, and probably annoying bits in all of my papers, where I say things like, no, I'm not saying this is true of everything. I'm not saying that this is a sort of general claim. You can tell that when I say that, I kind of secretly think it is, right? But in the context of the paper, of course, I can't establish that, and nor am I interested in doing so. I'm sort of going, hey, here's a way that we can understand this instance. Here's some interesting theoretical tools. How might these be applied in different places, right? So it's a much more sort of, in a sense, pragmatic way of operating than, say, someone like Carol Cleland is working, right? I'm not really making particularly general claims. I'm rather saying, here's a sort of pattern that I've seen, that I've sort of picked up on, and here's my account of it. Here's what I think might be going on. But of course, this is also a call to other people to go, here's where this doesn't work. Here's where actually you need to say something different. And I think you're right that a good place to start making trouble for me is to start looking for cases where they look like they should be integrating well and they're not, where the integration is just not working. And I think that's a really rich area. So that's my short answer to that. Let's go back to the big room.
Okay, thank you very much. This is very interesting. So I have a question, or rather a complaint about the last part about speculation. So you tied as you call it, material speculation, and you sort of tied to John Norton's account of material induction. It's very clear why you are doing that, because there are not these sort of abstract patterns of reasoning that get us the result, but rather the local facts that we tie into sort of an interpretation, and then we get a kind of result. That's sort of what you mean now. I think that sort of reasoning, or kind of a pattern of way of reasoning, works really well where Norton applied it in physics, and much of physics really looks like that. The problem that I have with that is, it seems to me that archaeology really is kind of, or speculation archaeology, is really kind of a discipline where we could go in a really opposite direction. And so when we say speculation, then it has to be a really wide range of possibilities that we come up with based on very, in a way, meager sort of material fact, or sort of a list of facts. And the main reason, it seems to me, is that the background knowledge can really taint or sort of constrain our attempts at speculation that can make them then sort of fairly useful for what we are trying to do. So, you know, who made the flints? Everybody. Who minted coins? Who baked bread? If we compare it to what we do now as a society, mainly, we are not really going to get very far. And the main thing to do is to get away from that, it seems to me, in archaeology, in many cases. So, anyways, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like this question of what, yeah, I mean, it's sort of trying to get at sort of the role of speculation in archaeology in particular, as opposed to other historical sciences, is something which I'm, you know, by which I mean paleontology, is something which I'm sort of really only starting to kind of grapple with. Because as you say, it's a very, very difficult and sort of rich sort of question, right? What makes for a good piece of archaeological speculation? I think I've got a pretty good answer for that in this, at least some areas of paleontology. But in archaeology, because you're interested in such a wide range of different types of sort of possible human expression, human social arrangement, demographic patterns, there's so many different things, as it were, that you might speculate about. It makes it really difficult to kind of narrow down under what circumstances you might think that speculation is playing a particular function or doing something special. Now, one of the things you talk about, which I think is interesting, is, of course, you might think in archaeology that you've got this much wider range of possibilities, and this makes speculation kind of challenging in a sort of particular way. So this is similar to the sort of worries I talk about a little bit in the paper about these sort of worries about interpretation, where, hey, there's such a wide range of interpretation for archaeological objects that how could we possibly get there? And one of the things I'm tempted to say is one of the things that's really interesting about things like experimental archaeology is how good archaeologists are at finding places where that's not true, right? Like there are very few ways of successfully building a flint axe. That's not easy to do. And in fact, it seems like, you know, especially as a human with only various tools, the scope that you might do that with is really, really limited. And I think one of the things that's going on here, which I think Alison Wiley captures really, really beautifully, especially with their work with Bob Chapman, is the way in which the material record really just doesn't do what you want it to sometimes, right? Well, this might come up with the earlier worry about, well, we can cherry pick examples, but at least Alison's impressed and I'm impressed by how often it is that the material record just refuses to play ball with our kind of presuppositions. And I think that thinking hard about the way that archaeologists work with the materials they have, whether this be parts of the archaeological record or whether this be the things they're doing experimental archaeology with, I think is a good way to start forming an answer to this really important question that you posed. So I think some archaeological questions are wildly underdetermined, and it's very unclear how you might speculate with them productively. This is part of what was going on in, say, processualist archaeology, right? It was a movement to try and start asking questions that aren't so wildly unconstrained that we can't hope to get anywhere. I think they took it too far. And I think that archaeologists these days are much better at finding a nice middle ground between those things. So that's what I'll take to that. I'm going to have to go very, very soon. I'm told that at this conference I'm at, everyone is going to leave at 7:30 on the dot to catch a bus, and if I miss them, I am screwed. Maybe I'll just check whether there's any other questions from someone who hasn't asked one as yet, just to make sure.
So no more questions. It's
time for a short question. I've told them please don't leave without me, but
next time we'll collect the questions.
I mean, to not build too much into sort of national stereotypes. I'm in Hamburg. Germans care about time. Okay, so next week we're going to have this different structure where I'll do a shorter little lecture thing, which is me trying to explain Megan Page's paper to the best of my ability and us thinking about what we might want to talk to her about. And then we'll meet on Thursday with her. And the idea is this gives us a chance to kind of say things about the paper that perhaps we wouldn't want to say if Megan was there, who knows, or at least to sort of have a chat amongst ourselves and then have the sort of other discussion, which would be more like a kind of interview and a back and forth. So it should be sort of lots of fun. I really enjoyed that. Thank you for being flexible with time, you all.
Thank you.